What do a roasted swan, a golden cake, and a sip of Cypriot wine by torchlight have in common? All this is not fantasy, but the reality of the table of medieval nobility. When the cold halls of castles were filled with the aromas of spices that no one in the area had even seen, it was enough for the nobles to take one look at the dish served to remind everyone who was in charge. In a world where commoners chewed turnip and barley porridge for weeks, every bite that went into a nobleman's mouth was a work of art, an act of power, a sign of unattainable luxury. Why, at that time, could food say more about a man than his coat of arms or sword? Today, let's look into a world where food was not just a meal, but a sign of privilege, fear, and power. Where a roasted peacock could cost more than a soldier, and sugar could be considered medicine and a symbol of power. Welcome to the table of those who could afford it. In the Middle Ages, food on the table of a nobleman meant much more than just satiation. It was a public assertion of power, prestige, and influence. Every dish, every movement of a servant, every bite served on a gilded plate carried a political connotation, showing those gathered who was the master of the situation. The rarer, more expensive, and more exquisite the food, the louder the meal spoke, especially in an environment where the majority of the population ate sparingly and monotonously. A feast in a palace or castle became a carefully planned performance, a kind of ceremony that involved not only cooks and servants, but also musicians, jesters, decorators, and even specially hired tasters. Sumptuous banquets were often accompanied by theatrical scenes, games, and serving dishes with the effect of surprise. For example, a cake from which live birds flew out when cut. Such dinners lasted 6 to 8 hours and were not just a meal, but a stage on which the power of the house and its master was demonstrated. For example, at the coronation feast of King Henry IV of England in 1399, more than 600 dishes were served, including roasted cranes, peacocks, and exotic sea animals brought from distant shores. French nobility preferred to organize feasts with sugar figures symbolizing scenes from the Bible or ancient history. The dishes themselves were often colored with saffron or even coated with a thin layer of edible gold to emphasize grandeur and wealth. Even the Venetian aristocracy, with access to the sea, ostentatiously displayed foods from the Far East on their tables to emphasize their trade ties and cultural awareness. Meat was served in abundance: venison, game, piglets, fish, sometimes in deceptive forms. For example, pieces of meat could be colored and assembled in the form of a fantastic beast. In addition to taste, the visual impression was also important. Dishes were decorated with feathers, precious stones, and fabrics. Serving was accompanied by the ringing of bells and sometimes entire musical numbers to impress guests and cement the family's status. Meals were divided into acts like theater productions, cold appetizers, hot dishes, sweet dishes, and finally a surprise, an elaborate installation or culinary marvel. For guests of the nobility, food became an opportunity to read the hierarchy. Who sits closest to the host, who is treated to the most expensive dishes. Even the water used to wash hands before eating could be flavored and served in silver bowls, accompanied by a ritual. Thus, food in the medieval world of the rich was not just a source of energy, it served as a language of power and a sign of chosenness. Over a meal, negotiations were conducted, alliances were born, and reputations fell, and so every feast was carefully staged. In medieval Europe, meat was more than just a foodstuff. It became a symbol of wealth, power, and dominance. The higher the position in society, the more often meat appeared on the table, and the less often it was accompanied by modest cereals or vegetables. For the commoner, meat remained rare, at best on holidays, while the nobility ate it almost daily. The nobility was not limited to the usual types of animals. Their diet included swans, cranes, peacocks, and even dolphins, which were considered a delicacy. At feasts in England in the 14th century, served dishes from hedgehogs and marmots, and in France valued beaver tails, especially in Lent. The church recognized them as a fish product. The meat of exotic animals was often delivered with more effort than spices and was flaunted as a symbol of international ties and power. Sometimes, to enhance the effect, the carcass of an animal was roasted in one piece. For example, a peacock whose feather was removed before cooking and then put back on before serving. Such dishes were not so much for satiety as for theatrical effect. It was an element of displaying taste, influence, and luxury. A 13th century German chronicler mentions a meat mountain on the table of the Duke of Austria, a pyramid of veal, chicken, and grouse, decorated with gold ribbons. Special attention was paid to game, because hunting was considered the prerogative of the nobility, which meant that a dish of wild boar or pheasant had the status of personal valor. Venison, hare, wild duck. All this went into the cauldrons and roasters of the great houses, and recipes were often passed down as part of the family heritage. Meat also differed in status. Ox and pork were eaten for large gatherings, while small game was reserved for select guests. Recipes for meat dishes of the nobility often included elaborate sauces of nutmeg, cloves, and wine, spices available only to the wealthiest. Such food was heavy, rich, and expensive to prepare. But that was what made it a sign of wealth and high status. In 14th century Burgundy, aristocrats had separate cellars with aged meats, smoked meats, and salted selections. The food became a reflection of social hierarchy. Meat was served in different quantities and types, depending on the rank of the person sitting at the table. Servants and common guests ate the less noble parts of the carcass, while the chosen ones ate roasted tongues, kidneys, brains, and livers seasoned with gold dust. It was not uncommon for meat to be the main course of all 3 meals of the day, especially in winter, when fresh vegetables were not available. Historical records show that the English royal court under Edward the Ferniers in 1306 consumed over 2,000 head of cattle in a single week. This volume was due not only to the number of courtiers, but also to the constant need to demonstrate generosity and power. In Pisa and Florence, wealthy merchants organized competitions of generosity, competing in the rarity and quantity of meat on the table. Meat also played a role in diplomacy. Valuable cuts were sent as gifts, accompanied by letters and family coats of arms. A feast could be an act of political statement. Meat placed on the table spoke of strong alliances and economic stability. In this way, meat became an instrument of influence, accessible only to those who owned land, hunting grounds, and connections. All this made meat not only food, but also a stage for demonstrating power, literally and metaphorically. In the feudal world, where food meant control over land and people, meat became a direct reflection of the power structure. So feasts were eaten not for satiety, but for status, and the fate of entire regions was decided at the meat table. In the Middle Ages, hunting was not just a way of getting food. It was considered a form of expression of power, bravery, and aristocratic valor. The right to hunt was strictly protected. In most European countries, it was reserved for the nobility and punished for violation, especially in royal forests. Even free citizens could not hunt without permission. Game became not just food, but a political resource and a symbol of power. The most valuable was hunting large and rare animals, bears, wild boars, deer, as well as exotic birds like cranes and herons. Bear meat was prized for its strength and fat content, especially in Scandinavia. And in Royal England, the swan, a symbol of majesty and purity, was considered a special delicacy. On the tables of the French dukes appeared the carcasses of peacocks, which were roasted whole, and then returned their feathers for theatrical serving. Game was served not just as food, it was a whole ritual, accompanied by music, speeches, and the solemn bringing out of the dish to the drums. The meat was placed on huge silver or wooden dishes decorated with spruce branches, fruit, and symbols of the hunter's family. Often, family crests were embroidered on the feathers of a peacock or swan, or figures of hunting scenes were carved out of dough. English documents of the 14th century mention royal feasts, where more than 40 different birds and animals were brought out on a tray. Feast with game was accompanied by a special hierarchy of serving. The first served more rare and clean animals, followed by the usual prey like hares and ducks. The meat of large animals was often smoked, cured, or stewed in wine sauces to emphasize the refinement of the cook's art. In some cases, the head of a slain animal, such as a boar, with an apple in its mouth, was placed on the table as a symbol of man's victory over wildlife. Falcon hunting played a special role. Hunting birds were valued above gold. and they were given as a gesture of exclusive respect between royal courts. At a meal, such a falcon catch, partridges or pigeons, became the decoration of the evening and an occasion for a conversation about the origin and dignity of the hunter. In northern Italy, game hunting was closely linked to the calendar of church festivals. On certain days, hunting was allowed, or, on the contrary, strictly forbidden. On such days, the nobility had to rely on stocked game, dried, or salted, stored in cellars and stone pantries. Even recipes for game dishes were passed down with great care, often orally from cook to cook, as part of a family or clan secret. Periods of fasting in the Middle Ages were obligatory for everyone, regardless of class. The church strictly monitored the observance of the calendar of abstinence. However, the nobility, possessing means and connections, found sophisticated ways not only to observe these rules, but also to turn the fasting days into culinary feasts. The ban on meat did not mean the denial of pleasures. On the tables of the nobility appeared exquisite fish dishes, sometimes even more expensive than meat dishes. Fish, especially rare or brought from afar, became an indicator of wealth and sophisticated taste of the owner of the house. In addition to sturgeon, eel, sterlet, and salmon, sea catches were added. Tuna, anchovies, flounder, and sometimes even sharks, salted and brought from the southern coasts. In the north of Italy, including Pisa, Mediterranean oysters and mussels were highly valued and brought alive in barrels of seawater. Imported fish was often more expensive than game, especially if it came from the coasts of England, Flanders, or Sicily, such as Atlantic cod. Dried cod was soaked and baked in spices, wine vinegar, and honey before serving. Recipes are preserved in monastic records. Carp were stuffed with almonds, figs, and spices, baked in dough or honey glaze, and served in the form of golden figurines. There were also special false dishes, skillfully prepared fish dishes that looked like meat, stuffed pike in the form of a goose, or burbot resembling a roasted pig. Lent days fell not only on Lent, but also on every Friday, the eve of feasts and penitential periods set by the church calendar. This meant that there were more than 130 days in a year when meat was replaced by fish, and so nobles had to invest in fish sellers and connections with trade guilds. The wealthiest families even owned their own carp and eel ponds, such as the Ordelaffi family in Romagna or the families of the judges of Pisa. Monasteries also played an important role in fish farming and supply. The Benedictines, for example, created entire aquatic complexes where they raised trout and tench. From there, the fish made its way to markets and noblemen's homes and was also used for diplomatic gifts, presented in wooden crates decorated with coats of arms. Such a gift was considered a sign of respect, as ensuring the delivery of fresh fish in winter was a demonstration of wealth, logistics, and attention to detail. At feasts, fish was often served with saffron, rosewater, and sweet wine sauces, which made its taste unusual and emphasized refined. Caviar paste mixed with nuts and honey was especially popular. It was served as an appetizer with Lenten wine or as a dessert. Some cooks even made Lenten cheesecakes from fish mass and almond milk, seasoning them with cinnamon and dried flowers. The most extravagant dishes were prepared especially for religious holidays falling on Lent. For example, stuffed sterlet in the shape of a knight on a horse. In Italian city-states, including Pisa, there were even special edicts defining the permissible types of fish on Lenten days. Violation was punishable by a fine. Such regulation emphasized social distance. The rich could afford to skirt the rules with sophistication, while the poor were content with salted sprat and bread. In the Middle Ages, bread was more than just food. It reflected the social status, wealth, and even moral attitudes of the householder. For the common people, bread was baked from rye, oats, barley, and sometimes from additives like chalk or swede. Dense, dark, heavy, it quickly became stale and was often used as a plate. The nobility enjoyed bread made of pure white wheat flour, which was sifted several times and cost several times more. White bread, panis blancus, was considered a symbol of refinement and high origin. It was prepared in monasteries, courts, and even called the bread of angels. Sometimes it contained additives such as honey, almond flour, or rose petals. delicate flavors that emphasize the exclusivity of the dish and its serving only at special meals. In cities like Pisa, such breads were baked only in certain bakeries that had received permission from the city government and paid special taxes. Meat, fish, and vegetable pies baked in a thick wheat crust were served whole at the feast and then cut in front of the guests. It was almost a theatrical act. One chronicler describes a feast in Bologna where a live starling came out of the pie. So elaborate were some of these dishes. Cereals were used not only for bread. Wheat and millet were used to make porridge, casseroles, puddings, and even drinks, especially in the cold season. Manna porridge boiled with almond milk and flavored with cinnamon was served for breakfast to rich children and monks of high rank. Wheat cakes with saffron and raisins were considered particularly appropriate on feast days, replacing the usual sweets, especially during Lent. Unlike peasants who were entitled to one round bread per day, the nobility could afford different kinds of pastries during one meal. In addition to the main bread, trenchers, edible liner, were served, as well as miniature pies, poppy seed buns, breadcrumbs with honey, and flatbreads with rosemary. Some of these were prepared several days before the meal to achieve a special density and flavor and stored in carved wooden boxes. For noble ladies, dessert bread was of special importance. It was light, crumbly, sometimes in the form of a ring or braid, and could be colored with natural juices. In the noble houses of Pisa and Florence, there was a tradition of offering bread of blessing, a decorated loaf, which was broken by the head of the family before eating. This bread was sometimes sent to monasteries and hospitals as a gesture of mercy, and the act of giving had a deep symbolism of power and generosity. In the palaces and rich houses of the Middle Ages, the sweet end of the meal was not just a treat, but a triumph of taste, status, and power over nature. On the tables of the nobility appeared overseas dried fruits, dates, figs, raisins from Cordoba, apricots from Persia, delivered through the Venetian and Genoese trade networks. With fresh fruit unavailable in winter, it was the expensive dried fruit that became a symbol of wealth and long-distance trade links. Sugar in the Middle Ages was rare, almost precious. It was called white gold and kept in sealed boxes as medicine and as a special treat. It came from Egypt and Crete, later from Sicily, and cost many times more than honey, which remained the main sweetener among even the wealthy classes. Honey, especially forest or heather honey, was highly valued for its flavor and density, and was added to porridge, dough, meat sauces, and even pickled fruit. Sweet dishes included almond paste, rice pudding with almond milk, fruit mousses, and marzipan figures covered with edible gold. The dessert was often decorated with fresh flowers, cornflowers, roses, violets, and the dishes were placed on silver trays to emphasize their value. The chef's ability to compose a layered, sweet, and savory finale to a meal was considered an art for which he could be invited to the court of a duke. Spices became the currency of wealthy homes. Cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, saffron, and ginger were measured in ounces but valued like jewelry. Saffron especially was valued as a symbol of luxury. 1 ounce could cost as much as the average worker earned in a month, and its fragrance permeated the entire feast. Adding saffron to dishes, especially sweet ones, porridge, pies, cookies, served not only to flavor, but also to assert the power of the family on a sensual level. Cloves, nutmeg, anise, ginger. These imported spices were used not only for flavor, but also as a means of surprise, provocation, almost magical influence. Guests who tasted ginger pie or clove jam for the first time could not hide their amazement, and the cook who created such a miracle was praised by the whole hall. Chronicles describe feasts at the court of Charles the Bold, where flour, sugar, and spices were used to create entire castles and scenes from the Bible. Edible, flavorful, priceless. Desserts also carried a political meaning. They were given as diplomatic gifts, sent with letters, as a sign of goodwill or patronage. A sweet gift from a duke or bishop symbolized a union, and its decoration could be even more important than its content. The gilded box was valued no less. Wine and honey, ale and beer, alcohol in the life of medieval nobility was not just a drink, but a sign of culture, connections, and status. a reflection of taste and power. Its use had a ritual and social meaning. Drinks accompanied negotiations, feasts, religious rites, and solemn oaths. The presence of a particular wine or honey in a nobleman's house meant many things, down to the level of proximity to trade routes and diplomatic circles. Mead or honey was one of the oldest drinks in Europe. It was known to the Celts, Germans, and Slavs, and was served at weddings and feasts in the early Middle Ages. The richer a person was, the stronger and sweeter the honey was prepared, infusing it with herbs, spices, or adding rare berries and flower essences. At feasts, honey was served in decorated goblets, sometimes with lids, sometimes in wooden bowls carved with the coat of arms of the master of the house. Wine in the 13th or 14th centuries was considered the drink of the South. France, Italy, Spain, and its delivery to the north of Europe cost a fortune. Red Burgundy, white Rhine, or Sicilian sweet wine appeared only on the tables of aristocrats and only on special occasions. Barrels were often accompanied by armed caravans because wine, especially aged wine, was as valuable as silver and fabrics of the Orient. Local wines, especially in southern cities like Pisa, also played a role. Monasteries produced good varieties, fortified, suitable for storage. Wine was drunk diluted with water, but for especially distinguished guests they could serve undiluted wine, as in Rome, emphasizing the knowledge of ancient tradition. Historians note that dilution was a matter of taste and measure, but it was diluted wine that was considered a sign of civility. It was more common in Britain, Scandinavia, and the northern regions, but it could also be served in Pisa in honor of overseas visitors or a warrior from the northern lands. At royal and ducal feasts, specially trained cupbearers served drinks in order, from light wine to strong infusions with honey. Each cup had its own place and time. It was tasted to music, to the reading of chronicles, to the announcement of victories or wedding vows. Wine was not only an accompaniment to food, it complemented it, revealing the flavors of meat, game, cheeses, and sweets in a new light. Imported wines were not only a matter of luxury, but also of political prestige. An agreement on the supply of wine from Cyprus or Alsace became an event. Such wines were poured into thin glass goblets, which were a curiosity in themselves, and served to the music of the lute or choral singing. Often the drinks themselves were mentioned in chronicles. The king granted the count a Sicilian wine aged for 30 years, and that meant a lot. Alcohol also played the role of medicine and magic. Monastic tinctures were prepared to warm the blood and banish the evil cold. Noble families kept vials of St. John's wine, herbs for the evil eye, and even drinks of vigor for tired soldiers. Thus elixirs moved into the realm of personal medicine, where honey, cinnamon, and wine were mixed to heal the body and strengthen the spirit. Often the gift between influential families was not rings or cloths, but barrels of rare wine with signatures, seals, and blessings. They were carried on ships accompanied by servants, presented as gifts symbolizing trust, alliance, or truce after a quarrel. Thus, alcohol became a language of diplomacy, a temple of taste, a tool of communication, as important as a coat of arms or a sword. In the kitchen of a castle or palace, not only the water in the cauldrons was always boiling, but politics itself. Cooks were not just servants, but close to the body and trust of those in power. After all, they were the ones entrusted with the food for kings and dukes, and the delicate threads of court intrigue were woven into every morning, filled with the aromas of roasted meat and herbs. In the Middle Ages, a cook could be at the same time a healer, a poisoner, a counselor, a spy, and for this reason he bore the stamp of trust, but also of constant suspicion. History knows examples when great culinary artists became political figures. For example, Master Guillaume Tirel, known as Tailhaven, served at the court of Charles Emmanuel of France. Tailhaven was so close to the court that he accompanied the king on trips, participated in diplomatic dinners, and knew the secrets of culinary diplomacy. The cook in the castle was not just a craftsman with a knife, but a guardian of royal life. Poison could be served with a swan, and salvation with honey and an infusion of cloves. For this reason, guards were assigned to the cooks. Only a select few were allowed into the kitchen, and the food was often inspected by special trusted people, food tasters. Sometimes the cook himself ate first and later, under the supervision of the guards, served the dishes on the feast table, each time walking between fear and glory. Many of these chefs left behind recipes that are now considered gems of gastronomic history, such as Le Viandier, written by the same Tilhaven. Each dish had a meaning. A swan adorned with gilded feathers symbolized power, and a roasted peacock symbolized power and the integrity of the family. These secret culinary schools formed the elite of the art of cooking, where the role of seasonings, the way of marinating meat or serving fish, turned into secret rituals. This is how legends were created. Dishes that could be cooked only by a select few and only on great holidays. Weddings, coronations, the conclusion of peace. Cooking was also an art of persuasion. Ambassadors of countries could be enticed not only by gifts, but also by a meal during which the cuisine demonstrated the greatness of the country. If a diplomat admired the taste of a dish, it meant a hidden concession, a diplomatic gesture of recognition of the sophistication and power of the hosts. The very act of serving a meal, bringing it into the hall, lighting it with candles, accompanying it with music and smells, was almost theatrical. The cooks participated in rehearsals of the feast, sometimes even being trained in etiquette and performance, so that the impression of the food would be as strong as that of the armor or the king's speech. Noble ladies threw handkerchiefs to the cooks if the dish caused delight, and guests clapped on the table, a sign of gratitude and recognition. Thus, the kitchen in the Middle Ages is not just a place of cooking, but the heart of the house, the point of contact of taste, power, and fear. The medieval feast of the nobility was not just a meal, but a carefully calibrated ceremony where every movement, every seat at the long table signified status and hierarchy. Guests were not seated arbitrarily. There was a strict order, and even a slight deviation from it could be taken as a challenge or an insult. Sometimes the guests were also separated by gender. Women, especially among the nobility, were seated in a special part of the hall, with their own service and their own dishes. Before the start of the meal, the ceremony of washing hands was obligatory, either in the presence of servants or through portable hand basins decorated with chasing. A special role was played by tasters, people who were obliged to be the first to taste food and drinks before serving them on the main table. As a rule, the taster was a man of honor, sometimes even a relative of the host, because the safety of the Lord depended on his participation. Poisons, especially in the 14th and 15th centuries, became a tool of palace conspiracies, and every feast required a ritual of trust, a tasting as a public act of devotion. The serving of dishes was strictly staggered, from light to heavy, from soups and vegetables to meat and pies, from simple to elaborate. Servants brought out the food on silver or gilded trays, accompanied by music and even commentary by heralds naming the dishes and their cooks. Some meals were accompanied by small skits or games. For example, a swan might be brought out accompanied by actors portraying a hunt. There were few utensils. Everyone had a knife, but a fork was rarely used in Western Europe, considering it a luxury item and even indecent. Food was put on thick slices of bread, which was then given to servants or the poor, so the bread served both as a plate and as alms. Salt was placed only in the middle of the table, and if a person sat below the salt, it meant his lower importance in the hierarchy. Refusal of food had a special meaning. It could be a sign of protest, grief, illness, but also often demonstrated rebellion against the host or resentment. If a guest ostentatiously did not touch the food, it instantly became a subject of discussion. There were no casual gestures at the table. On the contrary, active participation in the meal, praise, and even a request for more was a sign of recognition of the power and generosity of the host. Each feast was opened with a prayer and sometimes a whole church blessing, especially if it was a feast before a war or a wedding. Minstrels or jesters could be found near the main table to entertain the guests while the food was being served. The entertainment was in keeping with the pace of the meal. Even the manner of chewing, speaking, and raising the cup was discussed and regulated, especially in royal courts. Sometimes official ceremonies took place during the feast, knighting, signing treaties, announcing weddings or war. On such occasions, the food became the backdrop for political action, and everyone present witnessed a new turn in history. The dishes themselves often had symbolic meanings at that moment. A pigeon pie, for example, meant peace, and a roast boar meant strength and hunting prowess. At the end of the meal, special treats were served to cleanse the breath: seed cakes, mint, strong tinctures, or wine with spices. It was as important to end the feast properly as it was to begin it. It drew the line, closed the ritual, and gave a sense of completeness and blessing. The guests did not leave immediately. They waited until the host got up, and if he was delayed, it was a sign of his desire to prolong the feast or discuss important things in private. Thus, the medieval feast at the nobility is not just a meal, but a very complex ritual in which power, symbols, fears, and hopes were intertwined. While the high halls of the castles were filled with glittering goblets and tables bursting with game, wine, sugar, and fish, on the other side of the castle walls there was a very different tune: the squeak of hunger. The commoners, especially in times of crop failure or war, lived on the edge of survival, subsisting on turnips, sour mush made of leftover cereals and roots, and only dreaming of a piece of meat. The peasants working the land could not afford white flour bread. It went to the lords, while they themselves ate black, coarse, and often moldy bread. Against the daily malnutrition of the peasants, the feasts of the nobility seemed a feast of the gods, with platters of peacocks stuffed with golden ducks and seafood shipped from afar. This contrast was not only irritating but also infuriating, especially when the festivities took place in the midst of epidemics or in years when villages were starving to death. In the 14th century, during the Great Famine, 1315-1317, thousands died on the roads while castles continued to hold weddings, tournaments, and memorial feasts. Excess food among the nobility was not seen as a challenge, but as a natural right. Food was a symbol of their divine position, and generosity was considered a form of power. But for the poor, any discarded bone, any nibbled scrap was a luxury, and those who managed to serve at feasts often smuggled away the scraps. Sometimes servants would bring the leftovers from the castle kitchens to their families out of compassion, so kitchen waste became a real salvation for entire villages. Chronicles preserve evidence of how the hungry masses would congregate at the gates of castles during feasts, waiting for even a drop of soup or a bone from a pie. This silent observation of the feast outside, through cracks, from attics, from behind fences, has entered songs and legends as an image of perpetual inequality. When hunger became intolerable, and when plague or war undermined order, rebellions broke out, and it was the feast that became the trigger of rage. In 1381, during a peasant uprising in England, rebels burned down estates and destroyed kitchens, believing them to be symbols of injustice and greed. The chronicles say that one of the demands was sharing of food because the peasants believed that God did not create people to die with empty stomachs. Similar sentiments encompassed France during the Jacquerie and the German lands during the uprisings of the urban underclass. Food became a marker of oppression. Even in architecture, this division was blatant. The refectory halls of the nobility were high, with stained glass windows and frescoes, while the peasants ate in smoky huts without a table. Peasant food, in fact, was not cooked. It was cooked for a long time on leftover wood and often had no flavor. It was just a way to survive until the next morning. Meanwhile, the nobility hired foreign cooks, prescribed spices from India, dried lemons from Sicily, and wine from Aquitaine. Many monks left comments in their records about the inequality of stomachs. They observed how, for feasts, lords ate what could feed a village. That said, religious fasts were circumvented by using gimmicks. For example, meat was renamed fish, or fish was stuffed with meat, and the poor ate nothing at all on these days. The church did not condemn luxury directly, but preached generosity. A rich feast was to be accompanied by alms, but more often than not, it was a paltry remnant. The paradox is that the poverty of the peasants ensured the luxury of the nobility. It was they who grew the bread, slaughtered the cattle, built the cellars where their labor was then turned into a banquet. Although the nobility claimed that feasting was part of culture and a symbol of prosperity, in the eyes of hungry people, it looked like a feast during a pestilence. This is why folk parables often portray the rich as gluttons, whose bellies burst and souls burn for greed. At the same time, some castles organized showy food distributions, but more often to demonstrate generosity than out of conscience. These were carefully planned theaters of mercy. The table for the poor was placed behind walls, supervised by guards, and food was strictly limited. Nevertheless, these tinkerings were rare. Most nobles preferred to spend their excess on hunting, fireworks, outlandish entertainers, and rare spices. Stories of the sumptuous feasts of medieval nobility and the simultaneous, terrible hunger of the common people are not just pages from the past, but lessons about justice, power, and human nature that are still relevant today. When we remember those who lived in the age of knights and castles, it is important to realize, behind the glitter of the golden goblets lay the suffering of thousands whose struggle for survival forever changed the course of history. If you are interested in deep and lively stories about how our ancestors lived and survived in the harshest times, subscribe to our channel. Here the forgotten eras come to life, and each video helps to better understand the past to look wiser into the future.